All right, let me welcome everyone to this penultimate session of our series on the commentaries. Tonight, I want to explore with you a really fascinating and not well enough studied personality, a man by the name of Rabbi Shmuel David Luzzatto. And I just want to say by way of introduction, I should have mentioned this last week, particularly instrumental in my preparation for these classes are a series of essays written by Dr. Avigail Rock. Dr. Avigail Rock was a wonderful and very accomplished scholar of the Bible and professor in Israel. Rachel got to know her as she studied with her at Matan the year that we were in Israel. And tragically, she passed away just in the past year or two. Way too soon, but I wanted to acknowledge her contribution to this series and encourage you, if you're interested, just to Google her. You'll find lots of her shiurim online, many of which have been translated into English. Okay, I'm going to post the source sheet in the chat. If you don't have it, you can access it. You can access it there. It also went around on email. It's on the website. So please feel free to open it up at any point. I'll refer to it often, but I won't put it up on the screen so as not to distract us too much, except for every once in a while. Shmuel David Luzzatto, known by the acronym Shadal. Just by a quick show of hands, who's ever heard of Shmuel David Luzzatto? Okay, so he's not particularly well known. You may recognize the last name. Luzzatto is the very well-known rabbinic family in Italian Jewish history. Ramchal, Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, maybe the most famous person in that family. He was, I believe, a great uncle or thereabouts of the character that we're going to learn about tonight, Rabbi Shmuel David Luzzatto, who was born in 1800 in Trieste. Okay, anyone ever been to Trieste? I'll just put up the map briefly so you can get a sense of where this is. And here's a picture of our Shmuel David Luzzatto. On the map, you can see it's Trieste in present-day Italy is right on the border, right? If you want to take a trip to Slovenia and Croatia, so right, Trieste is in the middle of your trip. And that is where our character was born and where he grew up, where he spent his childhood. And the only other place that you really need to know for tonight's class is Padua, okay, which is just a stone's throw away on the map, at least from Venice. Keep in mind those two locations. A lot of times you learn about a famous Jewish personality, and they say, he was a genius when he was a kid. Not all great Jewish personalities were geniuses when they were kids. Shmuel David Luzzatto was a genius. He was a wunderkind. They didn't call him that. I don't know how you say that in Italian. But Italy was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire at the time, or at least Trieste was, northern Italy. So maybe they did call him a wunderkind. But he was reputed from a very, very young age to be a child prodigy and a genius. And he would compete in riddle contests and he would blow everyone away. And at the age of 11, he was already well on his way to writing a commentary on Eov, on the book of Job. Okay, so that should tell you something about who we are dealing with in the childhood of Reb Shmuel David Luzzatto. At the age of 13, he was plucked out of the school that he had been attending so that he could focus on his Talmudic studies exclusively. I'll just zoom out for a moment and say that, and as we come back to often when we talk about the 19th century, there's a raging debate between the traditionalists and the maskilim or the reformers, depending on where and when. One of the central areas of that debate in places like Germany, when we talked about Reb Samson Raphael Hirsch, one of the central areas of debate was curriculum. What did Jewish education look like and how much exposure should Jewish students have to secular studies and so on. In Italy, that really was not a locus of debate because it was just taken for granted that the Italian students, that young Italians would be, of course, in the natural course of things, exposed to a very broad and wide canon, that included not just Jewish studies, but general philosophy, science, math, literature, arts, humanities, etc. Okay, so he has this education until he's around 13, and then he begins to focus exclusively on Jewish studies. I'll pause for a moment to say that the personal life of Reb Shmuel David Lutzato of Shadal was really filled with tragedies. His mother died at a young age in 1814 when he was 14. His father died a short time later. In his married life, he lost his wife. He lost at least 2 children, filled with personal tragedies. None of this stopped him from accomplishing a great deal, as we'll talk about in a moment. His father wanted him to ply a trade, but he was opposed. He did whatever was needed after his mother died to help his father subsist and to help his family. In 1824, when Shadal was 24, his father died. And at that point, he was totally on his own, and he had to do something to support himself. But he was unwilling to leave the orbit of the Jewish world. He decided to take a job tutoring. Right, that's what one could do. You could be a private tutor and earn, eke out some kind of living in that way. He did that for 5 years. In 1829, he was appointed to be a teacher and to be one of the heads of the Rabbinical College of Padua, which had just been founded. Okay, there was a yeshiva for rabbinic training, essentially, which was, as we've talked about, unique in the 19th century. The models of yeshivos before the 19th century weren't invested in training rabbis per se. They were invested in creating Talmidei Chachamim, not in creating people who were intending to go on into professional careers in the rabbinate. In the 19th century, that changes. And in Padua, there's this traditional yeshiva, which is organized around the notion of creating professional rabbis. And Shadal spends the rest of his rabbinic life and the rest of his life, 36 more years from 1829 rather until 1865, the year of his death, he spends teaching at this rabbinical seminary. If you have the source sheet, let me ask you to turn to source number 1. I just want to share a citation from Cecil Roth. In the middle of the 20th century, Cecil Roth wrote the authoritative history of the history of the Jews of Italy, called The History of the Jews of Italy. It's since been updated and revised, but there's still a lot of very important material in his work. And he writes, source number 1, he says, the Collegio Rabbinico of Padua was the center of Jewish studies in Italy in the following generation. Its commanding figure was Samuel David Lutzato, Shadal, born in Trieste of working class parents who had been compelled to leave the Venetian territories as a result of the reactionary measures of 1777. That's how Shadal's parents ended up in Trieste, having fled Venice. A man of exceptional ability and attainments, though virtually self-taught, he was on the one hand the heir to the enlightened tradition of Italian Jewish scholarship, on the other, in close touch, owing to the temporary accident of Austrian expansion, with the Jewish intellectual revival in Northern Europe associated with the birth of Wissenschaft des Judentums, the science of Judaism. In his person, Italian Jewry was worthily and effectively associated with this movement. His fame would perhaps have been even greater had he concentrated his attention on a single subject, for his range of interest was dazzling. I'm going to come to this in a second. He collected and saved from oblivion large numbers of ancient manuscripts. He first edited the works of the greatest of medieval Hebrew poets, Yehuda Halevi, whose greatness he may be said to have rediscovered. He put Yehuda Halevi on the map of the 19th century. He wrote the first Jewish biblical commentaries in a modern sense. He translated the Bible and prayer book afresh into Italian. He collaborated in every Jewish learned periodical of the time, whether published in Hebrew or in German or in French. He provided the great foreign savants with bibliographical information. He set the science of Hebrew philology and grammar on a new basis. He edited the traditional liturgy according to the native Italian rite. At the same time, he continued the literary tradition of Italian Jewry by his prolific and polished, but not perhaps always inspired poems, which made him a significant figure in the revival of Hebrew belles letters. He has been termed the greatest Jew in an age so peculiarly rich in great Jews, at least an arguable evaluation. Okay, that's really a stunning synopsis of who Shadal was and what he accomplished. And I just want to put on the screen for a second, just so you get a sense. Some of the figures we've talked about in the past, wrote a book, or they wrote 2, or they wrote 10. I just picked up a list here and a catalog of the works written by Shadal. Okay, I'm just putting it on the screen. This is source number 2 on the source sheet. These are his published works. You could count them. I didn't count them. Dozens and dozens in Hebrew, and then dozens and dozens more in Italian. Okay. On top of these works, he published dozens, if not hundreds, of articles in contemporary journals, and we have 700 letters that were published in 9 volumes posthumously. Okay. It's just extraordinary. The breadth of his knowledge and the breadth of his scholarship. Right, there's almost no area that he didn't touch. He was polymath in the fullest sense of the term. Let me say just a couple more words of biographical background information to give you a sense of who we're dealing with, and a little to answer the implicit question, which is, if he's so great and he's so extraordinary and he wrote so, how come he's not a household name, right? We've heard of, Hirsch, and we've heard of the Malbim, but how come we haven't heard of Shadal nearly to this extent? Part of the answer, it's a complicated question. I'll just say, just to zoom out for a second, last week we talked about Chizkuni, and we have nothing. Like, we have no biographical information, and we can barely say when or where he lived. Right? Shadal is the opposite. You could write 12-volume biography of Shadal, you wouldn't finish, right? It would take a lifetime just to read his books. It's just so expansive. So why is it that we don't know more about Shadal? Part of the answer has to do with the fact that he doesn't fit. There's we always want to know, implicitly or explicitly, like, is that one of our guys? Is he on our team, or is he like on the opposing team? Now, people could be on the opposing team. You could still learn things from them. That's okay. But we kind of want to orient ourselves and get a sense, like, is he, like on Rav Hirsch's side, or is he the Reform opposition? Like, where do people fit in this spectrum? And it's very hard. It's very hard to place Shadal anywhere. Okay. He lived an Orthodox life, okay, by all accounts, even though it's very conspicuous that in all the portraits, right, he's never wearing a hat or yarmulke. But maybe that was just cultural. But by all accounts, right, he was a pious person in the sense of his personal piety. Someone who kept Shabbos and kept kosher and went to shul and davened. So where does this ambiguity come from? So I'll just share with you an excerpt from a nice article which was written on his the 100th anniversary of his yahrzeit in 1965. It's now an old article by a scholar named David Rudovsky. It's in source number 3 in your source sheets, and he writes the following. He says, neo-Orthodoxy in Judaism thus implies acceptance of the totality of Jewish law and practice within a framework of modernism. Right? So, the rough equivalent of what we would call modern Orthodoxy today, in the 19th century, we would call it neo-Orthodoxy. In Italy, its chief exponent was the brilliant and versatile Jewish scholar Samuel David Luzzatto, who with the other ideologues of the movement shared an a priori belief in the divine character of the Pentateuch. Okay, so Torah min hashamayim, we got it. According to them, the basic doctrines of Judaism fall outside the realm of reason, which is the product of human perception alone and not as reliable as a guide as divine revelation. So you could figure out what you could figure out, right? And this is one of the Spinoza challenges. But unless you accept that some things are going to be beyond us because they're revealed by God and God is inscrutable, so you're going to bark up a difficult tree. On this account, too, no one can question the miracles or supernatural events related in the Mosaic books, for they are beyond nature and experience. In general, the neo-Orthodoxy, like the Orthodox, followed the teachings of Judah Halevi, who extolled religion and faith over philosophy and logic. Lutzato warned that anyone who does not subscribe to the Sinaitic revelation and the Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch undermines Judaism. So Rudovsky was struggling. He's writing this, by the way, in Tradition, which is a journal of Orthodox Jewish thought. So he's trying to claim him as Orthodox, but it's not so simple. Shadal is an edgy character, and part of what makes him edgy is his willingness to say things that strain traditional norms. I'll just give you a couple of examples. There are many more, but for instance, we Orthodox Jews, believing Orthodox Jews, presume that the book of Koheles is written by Shlomo HaMelech. So it's not one of the 13 principles of faith. If you believe someone else wrote Koheles, you could still be an Orthodox Jew, but that's the sort of canonical, conventional wisdom. And Shadal says, no, it's not written by Shlomo. It's written by someone else named, Kohelet. So you could live with that, right? That you could find a way to manage absorbing that, and you wouldn't have to toss him out of Orthodox circles based on a comment like that alone. But let me just share with you one of the more problematic, if not the most problematic, comments that he makes in the course of the commentary that we're going to look at in a few moments. Okay, so this is source number 4 and 5 on your source sheet. It almost doesn't matter, right? The context almost doesn't matter, but I just want to create a little context for you. We're in the dreams that Yosef is interpreting in the dungeon, and he says, let me tell you the interpretation of the dream. Right, this is the baker. Right, 3 more days, Paro is going to come after your head. He's going to hang you. And very graphic, right? We don't usually spend a lot of time translating this because it's not pretty to picture in your mind, but you're going to be hanging and the birds are going to eat your flesh. There's an extra word in the pasuk, right? The pasuk should have stopped and says, and the birds are going to eat your flesh. And obviously mi'alacha, where the flesh is on you. What is the word mi'alacha? So just look what Shadal says, and it's a long comment, but I'll just share with you the first line. Yesh omrim. Okay, so he says, there are those who say, and he's not saying right or wrong, but there are those who say, Ki milas mi'alacha tau sofer. That's a mistake. The word mi'alacha, right, that's not, really shouldn't be in the Torah. Ki hasofer dalag shita achas v'kasav kan mi'alacha shebesof pasuk. Okay, and actually it kind of lined up in your source sheet, right? You can see the word mi'alacha in the previous line, the first half of the pasuk. So he says the sofer, the scribe, he made a mistake and he imported the word from the end of the previous line, but it shouldn't be there. It's extra. Can you imagine any traditional commentator, writing or saying such a thing? Like there's a mistake, and we once you go down that road, it's very problematic. Right? We believe that the Torah is min hashamayim, that we have an unbroken chain of a Masorah for 3,000 years from Moshe to 2021. And as soon as you start to put chinks in that chain, so that's, again, to put it lightly, very problematic, if not blasphemous or heretical. So, people want to defend Shadal and say, well, he just said as a yesh omrim. He's not saying that it is so, but in the interest of intellectual honesty, he wants to share a multiplicity of opinions, which he's fond of doing. Maybe, okay, but I pointed out just to say, this comment could never appear in any of the commentaries that we looked at, up until this point of the course of the past, 10, 15 weeks. It couldn't happen, right? There's no such room. There's no possibility for such a comment. And that's why it's so difficult to pin or peg the commentary of Shadal as specifically Orthodox, because he's so willing to make comments like this. That said, he defined himself as Orthodox, and he was a very staunch opponent of the burgeoning Reform movement in 19th century Padua. And he went on to say, you could see this in source number 6. I'll just read you one quick excerpt again from the Rudovsky reading. Emancipation, Luzzatto stresses, is not a panacea for all the ailments of Judaism, right? And this is coming from a very broad-minded man. Right? He says, the survival of the Jewish people depends far more on the creation among Jews of an esprit de corps, a feeling of brotherhood and kinship. Their major goal should not be the attainment of parity with their neighbors, but rather the development of a sense of national pride, which should stimulate the study of the Torah and the Hebrew language, and should discourage the spread of the spirit of Atticism, he means Hellenism, among them. Nor is emancipation an unmitigated blessing in France, Belgium, and Holland, where Jews have been completely enfranchised. Jewish creativity declined. Jewish religious growth was stunted, and the Torah and Hebrew language forgotten. The freedom in these countries was an invitation to fusion and assimilation. One of his poems, Shadal, inveighed against those maskilim who neglected their own heritage, preferred Goethe and Schiller to the Hebrew prophets and sages. So again, staunch, right? Harsh language for reformers. He says, this is not the way to maintain Judaism. This is not the way to preserve Judaism. This is not the way to continue our Masorah. You've gone too far. Very open-minded man, but at the same time, unwilling to accept the reform emphasis and the reform interest in so much openness that you risk acculturation and even assimilation. Let me say just a couple final quick points, sort of biographical points, and then I want to pause and take any questions or comments, and then turn to the commentary itself, which is the principal topic of tonight's talk. Nationalism, really didn't happen until later in the 19th century, but scholars basically would consider Shadal a proto-Zionist. He strongly believed, right, there was no Zionist movement, in his day. He was ahead of his time, but in principle, he was a major proponent of the study and the revivification of Hebrew. And he was a major proponent of the idea of a national homeland of the Jewish people, returning to the land and rejuvenating the land. That was certainly a part of his ethos. He opposed. He wasn't a strict rationalist, but he opposed mysticism by and large. And the last thing I'll say, which is a really important kind of point of interest, is his attitude toward the Zohar. Okay? So when was the Zohar written? Virtually all of the medieval commentaries and early modern commentaries and early modern rabbinic figures, with only a couple of notable exceptions, almost all of them believed that the Zohar was written by Reb Shimon Bar Yochai in the first century. Shadal was one of the early scholars to make a strong, scientifically based argument that the Zohar is an important text. No one was arguing that the Zohar is not an important text. They were just arguing, no, it's not from antiquity. It's not as old as you think it is. There's several arguments, that contemporary scholars make to stake out this claim. Shadal had a really fascinating one. He says, the Zohar is fond of interpreting nikudot, the diacritical notes, the vowels that we have in the text of the Torah. And Shadal says it's an anachronism. He says in Talmudic times, right, they didn't have those diacritical notes. So there's no alternative. If there's somebody in the Zohar writing about diacritical notes, it has to be because the person writing in the Zohar is not living in the first century. They're living in I don't know if he dated it, but we would say, contemporary scholarship would say, the 13th century. So again, using the full weight of scientific analysis to opine on and bring and bring light to an analysis of the tradition and the traditional texts. Okay, let me pause here and just, I know that was a lot, but let me ask if there are any questions or comments, and then I want to turn to Shadal's commentary itself. Okay, so I want to share with you, let's say 4 or 5, maybe 6 observations about Shadal's commentary that contribute to a unique commentary among the history of commentaries to the Torah. His text was published in his lifetime in 1847. And it was mostly culled from lectures and discussions that he had with his students. In another way, he's the opposite of the Chizkuni. I mentioned last week that Chizkuni likes to retain anonymity. Now, Yossi and I discussed this maybe for a minute or two after the class, but this notion that Chizkuni wanted to give everyone a fair shake. So I'm not going to tell you it's a machlokas between Rashi and a guy named Chaim. You're never going to listen to Chaim's opinion, even if it's really compelling. So I'm just going to tell you there's 2 opinions, right? Not with Rashi, but with any other commentary. So Shadal is the opposite. He says, and again, didn't put it on the source sheet, I don't think, but I'm happy to give you the references. Numerous times over the course of his commentary, he'll say, here's the pasuk. And student A in my class said it means X, and student B said it means Y, and student C said it means Z. And then he goes on to the next post. I'm just sharing with you, right? Like quoting my students. They're so creative and they're so smart. And let me share with you. And he names them. Chaim said this, and Steve said that, and here they are. So there's a kind of inherent humility in such an approach. Like, I don't have a monopoly on truth. We're all trying to figure out what the Torah means, and if somebody else has a good idea, I am more than happy to share it with you. It was true about information that he culled from his students, and it was true about information or comments that he culled from anywhere and everywhere. He's only too happy to call upon Jewish sources, historical sources, archaeological sources, philosophical sources, Christians, you name it, right? It's in there. And again, because he has command of half a dozen languages or more, and there's nothing that's not at his disposal, he brings it all to this commentary. Okay, so the first point I want to make comes from let's say a category that you could call grammar and or linguistics. So, and again, there's 100 examples, but in the interest of time, I just want to give you, 1 or 2 in each of these categories. I'll pull it up and put it on the screen. It's source number 7. Okay, so the Torah tells us that Hashem changed the name of Sarai to Sarah. Okay, source number 7. Vayomer Elokim al Avraham, Sarai ishtacha lo sikra shema Sarai, ki Sarah shema. Her name's not going to be Sarai anymore, it's going to be Sarah. Okay, so we know all kinds of midrashic explanations of where the hey came from and what that, but at the end of the day, we're kind of wondering, like, what is that all about? What's the meaning of her name? So Shadal says, I'll explain it to you based on my knowledge of language, which is extensive and probably not known to you, my dear reader. Lo tikra, source 8, lo tikra shema Sarai, ki Sarah shema. She's not going to be called Sarai, she's going to be called Sarah. Ubelashon Aravi, okay, because he speaks, and I don't know actually if he means Arabic or he might even mean Syriac. I think he was one of the early scholars of Syriac, like these ancient Semitic languages. Uvelashon Aravi, Sarah inyano holid zera rav. This root, right, the Sarah sound phonetically, what is it about? It's about giving birth to lots of progeny. Ve'ulai ha'hei shehi siman hanekiva nosfa be'Avraham v'Sarah l'siman pirya v'rivya. Okay, and of all the languages in the Hebrew alphabet, what does the hey do? The hey feminizes something. So you put it all together, the word Sarah, or however you would say it with an aleph at the end, I don't know if we preserve those distinctions, but the notion of Sarah means to have a lot of children. And if you add the hey and feminize it, right? So you've added the hey to Avram's name, you got a hey, and Sarai's name, you got a hey, L'siman Piri Veribia, to let you know that these people are going to be the patriarch and matriarch, the mother and father of great nations. So, wow, like that, you could take it or leave it, but that's a compelling case for what it means to change Sarai's name to Sarah. Okay. Any questions or comments about this linguistic point? All right, so let me move to my second point. This is maybe the subtlest point that I want to make tonight. So I just want to spend a minute seeing if I can make it clear and flesh it out so that it will be understandable. Let me say a word of background, and this is, hopefully easier for us to understand because we've been working on this challenge really whenever we talk about a commentary from the 19th century. How do we reconcile, how do we fit together the Torah Sheba'al Peh and the Torah Shebichsav? Right? There's a midrashic explanation. It seems like it's coming out of left field. How can I get it to jibe with the text, right? And the Malbim, right, had this great formulation. He said, the drash is the pshat, right? If you really know language and you really know the rules and you really understand what's going on here, you'll understand what the midrash is telling you about the pshat. It's not an alternate meaning. If you really dig deep, you'll see why that is the pshat. Shadal doesn't say that. Shadal has a different and kind of subtler approach to how to resolve conflicts between the oral interpretation of the text and the pshat interpretation of the text. So this is a classic example. It's really bolate. It's so conspicuous when you see it, and it's perfect because it comes directly from our parsha. Okay, you ready? This is source number 9. The pasuk tells us, "V'chiyiftach ish bor o yichra ish bor v'lo yichasenu." Someone opens a pit, they dig a pit, they don't cover it up. Trouble is brewing. V'nafal sham mashor o chamor. And some other guy is walking by, and they have an accident, and their ox or their donkey falls into the pit. Right, the ox or a pit, it's not a 6-inch pit, like it's a real ditch, and the animal dies as a result of the fall. Animals are the livelihood of the people, so it's a big deal, right? It's like you lost your car, so it's not a $200 issue; it's a $30,000. It's a big deal. So what's the law, right? We're trying to create a civil society here. So how do we decide what happens? So the Torah is explicit, black on white. Baal habor yishalem kesef yashiv leva'alav. Okay. The responsible party, the Baal habor, right, as if the pit could be owned. The guy who dug the pit, so he's got to pay the owner of the donkey, the victim. V'hamei siyelo. How do you translate the last 3 words of that pasuk? It's ambiguous, right? V'hames, the carcass. Right? So everything else is clear. Right? You caused $30,000 of damage because my car fell into your pit. So I'm going to pay you $30,000. Now, what about the junked car? What about the dead animal? It's not valueless. It has some value. So who gets that now? So the Hamei Cielo, he gets it. Well, who gets it? Right? It's like Abbott and Costello. He gets it. Who gets it? Who? So 99.9% of readers of this text, including biblical commentaries, right? So the point is that the guy who dug the pit makes full recompense for the damages. It was a $30,000. I'm going to pay you $30,000, and I keep the car. Okay, v'ames yihielo. That will be his. Okay. So the problem is that is not how the the rabbis read the pasuk. The rabbis read the pasuk that not that the Baal Habor keeps the carcass, but that the victim keeps the carcass. So how does that jibe, right? Shadal is what? How does that work with the pasuk? It doesn't make any sense. So look at source number 10. Have it here in the Hebrew and English. It's the Rashbam, the Pshat, right? He's the one commentary who's interested in the Pshat as opposed to the Midrashic explanation. He says, right, what we would expect that the damager, the guy who dug the pit, he's going to keep the carcass. Razal hikilu al hamazik ve'amru she'enu chayav l'shalom lo kesef mamish v'yachol l'shalom lo b'chol davar lefikach maniach lo hanavela u'mishalem lo kol ma she'achai shaveh yoser min ha-nevela. So just following the English, he says, but the rabbis decided to be more lenient than the Torah was to the one who caused the damage. They said that he does not have to make recompense specifically with money, right? But he can repay with any item, so he can leave him the carcass as partial payment. He's now justifying the rabbinic interpretation of this. Let the guy keep his animal and then give him a further monetary payment to make up for the difference between the worth of the live animal and the carcass. So what Shadal did is he preserved the midrash, but at the same time tipped his hat to the pshat of the pasuk. Marty Lukshin is a very fine biblical scholar, puts it this way. He says, whenever the pshat says one thing and the midrash says something very different, Shadal says the pshat is what the Torah means, and the midrash represents rabbinic legislation, not biblical interpretation. Rabbinic legislation, not biblical interpretation. He says, don't confuse the two. You see this medrash? The medrash is not telling you how to read the pasuk. The medrash is telling you what laws can be extracted from the pasuk, how to legislate, because that's the job of the rabbis. But what the pasuk actually means, that's not what the rabbis are telling. So very important kind of fundamental and principled approach to how to reconcile the disparity between pshat and drash. And his answer to the disparity is they're not talking to each other. They're not saying, it's not apples to apples. They're doing two totally different things. They're filling different functions. And as a result, one will look like X and one will look like Y. You don't have to reconcile them, right? The Malbim would say, no, the drash is no, they're not. They're not the same because they're doing two totally different things. One, right, pshat is to try to understand what the text is saying. Drash is trying to understand what the text is telling you about how to act, about what the halacha is saying. Okay. This is my second point about Shadal. Was to see him how he uses language and grammar. The second is to see more conceptually how he understands the different functions of pshat versus drash. One of the most important, and I think one of the most interesting contributions that Shadal makes is to give the text and the interpretation of the text a sense of history and a sense of context. And he can do it in a way that others just were not able to do because so much less was available to them as far as philology, anthropology, archaeology, history. He had it all. So he was able to add layers and layers of meaning to the text that were just not known to other commentaries as great or as smart as they were. Okay. So I'll just give you a couple quick examples. Okay, I'm not going to bring it up on the screen, but you have it on your source sheet. The first example is from the very beginning of Parshas Shmos. Remember the Mialdos, the midwives? So the Paro says, you're not supposed to let anybody live, and they decide they're going to defy the commands of Paro, and they deliver the Jewish babies. They let them live, and the Torah tells us, "V'yaki Yerumi aldos hasalukim v'yaslahem batim." Right? The summation of that chapter is, they feared God, and God rewarded them by giving them batim. So what does that mean? He gave them houses. So everyone's got an explanation. You remember Rashi, a famous Rashi on this. What did he give them? He gave them 3 houses, Bate Kahuna, Villavia, Umalchus. The descendants of Shifra and Pua, Miriam and Yocheved, ended up being the Kohanim, the Leviim, and the Malchus, and the kingship. Beautiful. Okay. Doesn't say those words, but the word batim, so, houses of royalty. Okay, the Rashbam is the opposite. He says, no. What was the reward? It wasn't a reward. It was Paro reacting to what they did wrong. He put them in their houses. He put them, we would say in English, under house arrest, because they were acting in defiance of the royal command. Shadal says, based on his study of anthropology, I'm not sure what to call it, maybe sociology, he says, who were the Mialdot? Who did they get to serve as midwives? He says the people who were serving as midwives were people who didn't have families of their own, which made them available at all hours of the night to go deliver a baby when they got the call. So what was the reward? The reward, he says, was that God granted them families of their own. So again, a sociological contextual, if you understand who these women would have been in that time and in that place, well, then the second half of the pasuk makes sense. You'll understand that Hashem gave them what they didn't have. The only way you could understand what they didn't have is if you knew something about history and sociology. I'll give you 2 more quick examples. Torah says, the coat of many colors. Yosef was given by his father a ketonet pasim. What is that? Like you wanted to have stripes, or it signified something special jacket. What is that? So Shadal says, I'll tell you what it was about. What it was about is, he says, you have to know something about what people would have been wearing at this time and this place. If you're out and about in the field and you got to do work, so you have to wear short sleeves. Otherwise, right, your clothes, short sleeves and short pants. Otherwise, everything's going to get tangled and it's going to be a mess and it's going to be totally inefficient. The only people who would wear long sleeves, historically, the only people who wear long sleeves would be the royalty, because they're not out and about in the field working. So the fact that he was given a ketonet pasim meant that Yosef had some special exalted status whereby he was exempted from the manual labor that his brothers were doing. And now you could understand very easily why. It wasn't just like, he got a new jacket. No, he was actually being identified by their father as being one who was exempt from work, while these guys have to be out in the fields tending to their flocks. Last example from history, just because I think it's so fascinating. I'll just pull it up in English in the interest of time. In source number 15. Fast forward, we had a version of this, recently in our parsha, but the more extended version comes, when the Jewish people get the man. But the more extended version comes in Parshas Baloscha, when the Jewish people are tired of eating the man, and they say, we don't want the man anymore. We remember the fish we used to get for free, the gourds and the cucumbers and the garlic, and how good we had it back in the old days. So, and everyone wonders, like, really? This is their story? This is what they got? They were slaves. They weren't getting anything for free. What could they possibly have been getting for free? So listen to what Shadal says, source number 16. He says the word chinam implies nothing less than free of charge. That's really what it means. Since the Egyptians supported the Israelites, providing them with cheap items of food, such as fish and cucumbers, which were plentiful in Egypt, we find that Herodotus informs us, right? Obviously he's reading this. We find that Herodotus informs us that on one of the Egyptian pyramids was an inscription reading that the king who erected it expended 1,600 measures of garlic and onions on food for the workmen. Herodotus further states, all Egyptians did not themselves eat fish, and it was therefore understandable why they gave it to the Israelites. Okay, so fascinating, right? You're never going to see this in a Ramban. You're never going to see this in the Malbim because they weren't reading, right, Herodotus. But Shadal is reading it, so he's able to import, right, the knowledge that he's gleaned from this, right, wildly, external source to help understand what the psukim are saying. And it's fascinating. He's doing this in the beginning of the 19th century. Now, right, 21st century Bible scholars do this all the time. They study, ancient Semitic languages, and they dig archaeological digs, and they use the information to try to inform how they understand Tanakh. Right? So Shadal was doing this 200 years ago in a really exceptional and a really extraordinary way. Before we run out of time, let me make one or two final points. One of the last things that I want to share with you is a kind of Weltanschauung that Shadal had about how Jerusalem and Athens compare and compete with one another. And the notion that Athens gave us culture and aesthetics, but it's insufficient. And you need Torah for a sense of what it means to be moral, and for what it means to have a sense of being humane. So a not insignificant portion of his commentary is devoted to the development and the, let's say, cultivation of morals on a human plane. So I'll give you one example. If you have the source sheet, I'll just pull it up. It's source number 18 and 19, and this comes up all the time. So there is a halacha. The Torah tells us, "V'shor oso v'espino los hishchatu b'yom echad." Okay, so we don't work out with flocks anymore, but there's an important halacha. It's an isser d'oraisa. It's a lo saseh that says you are not permitted to slaughter. You're not permitted to slaughter an animal and its young on the same day. Okay, literally, meaning you have a flock and you have the mother and the kid. So, one today, one tomorrow, because it's time to bring them to the slaughterhouse, whatever the case may be. You can't do it on the same day. Okay. So Shadal says, what's the rationale behind that? What is the Torah getting at? He says something, right? The formulation is striking. He says, Lo rachamim, source number 18. Lo rachamim al ha-behema mamish. Maybe you think like, you're supposed to be nice to your animals. So it would be very, I don't know what kind of emotional life we're imagining an animal has, but it would be somehow jarring, upsetting, disturbing for an animal to see or to know that another member of its biological family was being slaughtered. He says, no, that might be true, but that's not the point. The point is, says it's not about the animal. It's about cultivating human nature. It's about cultivating in our hearts the trait of compassion in order to distance ourselves from the trait of cruelty. And there's this notion that we can cultivate this. We can accustom ourselves to a particular kind of behavior, and it begins with the notion of acting in a compassionate way, not just to other people, but even to our animals. Okay. I'll just share with you an excerpt which I didn't put on the source sheet, but from that article with which I began, from Tradition. Luzzatto regarded Judaism in this light as a religion of the heart rather than of the intellect, which is really an extraordinary thing to say for someone who was so cerebral. It wasn't like he was writing loosey-goosey commentary. Right? This is Wissenschaft des Judentums, is a scholar of the highest rank. He says what's most important is not the intellect. Its doctrines, he observed, give it evidence of the spirit of compassion with which man is naturally endowed and which impels him to do good for its own sake. The sense of pity, what we would call rachamim, is an outgrowth of the normal human tendency of self-love projected to another being. This impulse animates, Luzzatto indicates, many of the scriptural and rabbinic precepts exemplified by the biblical provision for the return at night of the pledged garment, okay, which we also read about in our parsha this week, right? What to do with dress that you've taken as collateral, or the institution of the sabbatical year. What happens, right, when we're trying to redistribute funds to the needy and the vulnerable during a Shemitah year, which cancels all debts and relieves the poor man of paramount financial burden. Characteristic of this trait, too, is the rabbinic law prohibiting an employer from depriving the porters of their wages because they accidentally broke the barrel of wine they carry, and so on and so forth. He's always interested in extracting the kernel of the law, which speaks directly to the notion of acclimating a person toward more humane human behavior. We're almost out of time. I just want to share with you, it doesn't fit into any of the categories I just mentioned, but it's really just one of my favorite, I think it's one of my favorite episodes in Bereshis, and it's one of my favorite comments of Shadal. So I'll close with this. I'll put it up on the source sheet. Very last chapter of Sefer Bereshis. You remember the story? The story is the brothers have just buried Yaakov, and they come back, and they're nervous. They think now that Yaakov is gone, they think Yosef is going to exact vengeance upon them for the terrible things that they had done to him. They thought Yosef was just kind of biding time and being civil so as not to upset their father. Now that Yaakov's gone, wow, the hammer is really going to come down on us. So they send a messenger with this line. And they say, source 19, Kosam Ruli Yosef, bring the message, tell him, Ana sana psha chacha b'chatzav sechem, kirag malucha bi'ata sana lepesha avdi Elokei abicha, vayef Yosef b'dabra mila. In the name of their father, they send this message, Yosef, go easy on them. You should forgive them. Okay? The message comes to Yosef, your father, he never told you this in his lifetime, but he said you should forgive them, and Yosef cries. So why does Yosef cry? He's a smart guy. Look, what he's moved by this plight. Does he forgive them? Doesn't he forgive them? There's a lot of ambiguity in the text, but he cries. So what is that about? Shadal says, I'll tell you what it's about. You know why he cried? Vayef Yosef, he cried. Hevin. Ki achiv hem sheshalchu ashlichim. He's a smart guy. He saw right through the ruse. He knew immediately that this message was concocted and conjured up by the brothers. They sent the messengers. Below Yaakov tzivakos. Yaakov never sent them. If Yaakov ever meant for Yosef to hear a message, forgive your brother, he would have said it in his lifetime, or would have sent the message in his lifetime. Alkein bacha biroso tzaras achiv hayiraim lenafsham umochrachim lahamtzi tachbulos linatzel micharon apa. He cried because he understood. He understood how much the brothers were suffering. Wow, what kind of pangs of guilt they must be feeling for them to concoct a whole story out of thin air. A message from our father he never told you in his lifetime, but really what he meant to say, and now we're just sending it to you even though he's dead. He wanted you to know that the brothers should be forgiven. Yosef is like, oh my gosh, how much guilt must they be racked by for them to have come up with this whole story to convince me that in the name of my father I should go easy on. And so he cries because he understands at the end of the day that what was motivating this whole charade was a sense of deep remorse and deep guilt on the part of his brothers. Right? Shadal doesn't say it, but what he means, and they're not able to say it. Right? They're so embarrassed and they're so guilty that they have to make up a story. They can't even bring themselves to just confront Yosef by himself. Wow, he feels so much, right? Empathy for the pain that they're enduring, that Yosef himself cries. I think it's a very astute psychological observation. I conclude here just to come full circle, because I think, right, it's really extraordinary. Here's this man, Shadal, towering intellect and prolific. There's nothing the man didn't know. There's no language he didn't speak. Every discipline. You read that catalog of books that he published. It's just mind-boggling. And yet, right at the end of the day, what was most important to him was not the head, but the heart. Was about how you feel and about how you act and about how you treat other people. We're not going to solve the question of where we can plug him in and if he fits exactly into one particular spot and if he's perfectly orthodox. He's an edgy figure, but he's so colorful and so fascinating that I thought that we could spend at least one session opening up a few pages of Shadal to get a flavor for what his comments were all about. And I hope that we've accomplished that goal, at least in a small way. I mentioned at the beginning that next week will be the final session in this series. We'll be studying a little of the commentary of Rabbi David Tzvi Hoffman. And then 2 weeks from tonight, we'll do something special in honor of Purim. I'll conclude here, but I'm happy to stay on and talk with you further to address any questions and comments.